Hi, Lou here, and I am going to talk about what typically happened in wars before the modern era and how many, if not most, of our board games actually are not reflecting this very well. So, what we see in a typical board game is conquest. In other words, a player's nation takes over some other place and controls it entirely. And yet that's not typically what happened in ancient and medieval warfare. What happened was raiding, harrying, rearguard actions, foraging, chevauchée, it was called in France, just going and devastating everything. Not with the intention of conquering a place, but with the intention of taking resources away from the opponent and possibly driving away the opponent's people so that your people could move in. Let's take the ancient Near East, for example. We see maps that show the great empires of the Assyrians and so on and so forth. But what those empires tended to be were tribute empires, not occupation empires. Now, I've chosen those words. There may be historians who have other words for that. But a tribute empire is a case where the Assyrians or whoever marched in, clobbered the place, attacked enemy troops, and finally forced the enemy to give up and promise to pay tribute. And as long as the enemy continued to pay tribute, the Assyrians or whoever were happy with that situation. The Assyrians did not leave troops there. Now, in many cases, the subdued or supposedly subdued people kept rebelling, and finally the Assyrians got fed up and moved in and occupied the place. And perhaps one reason why the Assyrian Empire finally fell and fell rather rapidly is they overextended because they controlled so much territory and there just weren't all that many Assyrians to control all that territory. In the era of the Dark Ages, in Britain anyway, an awful lot of the fighting was raiding. You raided to take the opponent's cattle, take their food, and so on. And there was no intention of conquering because you didn't have a standing army to occupy some other place. Now, sometimes there was, in fact, a migration, as when the Anglo-Saxons came to England and they occupied the place. But they didn't drive away the people who already lived there, they merged with them. Typically, I think, Anglo-Saxon men marrying British women. And gradually, the nature of the place changed and the language changed, and you had a conquest in effect. But it was not a purposely arranged conquest, it just happened. Now, combine this with some other aspects of warfare, the uncertainty of battle in particular. Generals generally knew that there was a lot of chance in the battle, and so they didn't want to fight unless they had a really good reason. And since there wasn't much in the way of supply lines, you couldn't threaten supply lines. You could threaten bases and force people to defend the base, but not force them to come out and fight. Charlemagne, in particular, aware of the chances of battle, apparently avoided pitched battles and just overwhelmed by superior logistics, superior numbers, superior engineering. It's little known that at one point Charlemagne tried to dig a canal between the Rhine River and the Danube, but the area there is just not suitable for canals, so it didn't work out. But the actual distance was not very far at all. So they had superior engineering as well as superiority in other respects. One of the famous losses of Charlemagne was a rearguard action in Spain, where the French army was on Frankish army was on a very narrow path and they couldn't get back to help the rear guard, where Roland was, and it's famous because of the song of Roland, not because it was really that much big a deal. Of course, often in ancient and medieval warfare from about 900 BC on, you had cavalry. You didn't have cavalry before that. You had chariots, and there were times before that when there were no chariots even. But when you had cavalry, you had the additional speed of the cavalry to raid and cause mayhem. Of course, in all of this, there were lots of stratagems, ambushes, quick strikes, surprise, and so on. And you just don't get that generally in a war game. Now, that's partly because of scale. For example, my game Britannia, the scale is like 75 years per turn. You just don't have the opportunity to depict things like stratagems and ambushes and raids. Although the third edition of Britannia, assuming I get it out here sometime, does have a lot more raiding than the previous editions, which had raiding from the sea, but now raiding will be general in Britannia because that's the way it was in reality. Now there's a recent expression of this focusing primarily on early modern Europe. And one of the videos on YouTube, there are lots of very good historical videos about warfare on YouTube. And I will try to include the URL for that in the description of this video. Thanks for listening.